The palace stood as a gleaming testament to wealth and power, its golden spires piercing the cobalt sky. Yet within its walls, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. Khalid, the crown prince of Al-Zahra, had once been the embodiment of its brilliance, a man of sharp intellect, unshakable confidence, and boundless energy. Now, he was a prisoner of his own despair. It had been 8 months since the accident. The memory of that night still haunted him. The screech of tires, the blinding lights, and the unbearable silence that followed. When he awoke in the hospital, the world as he knew it had collapsed. The doctor's words were final. He would never walk again. Confined to a wheelchair, Khalid retreated into himself, refusing visitors, shirking responsibilities, and cutting ties with the vibrant life he once led. The man who had commanded rooms with his charisma now spent his days cloaked in solitude, his once pristine study strewn with untouched books and abandoned papers. The people of Al-Zahra whispered about their reclusive prince. Some pitied him, others questioned his ability to lead, but none of their murmurs reached the cold, silent chambers of his quarters. The only person who dared to intrude was his father, King Rashid. One evening, the king entered Khalid's room, his stern expression betraying a hint of worry. "Khalid," he began, his voice steady yet tinged with frustration. "This cannot continue. You are the crown prince. Your people need you. I need you." Khalid didn't look up from the window, where he sat staring into the desert's endless expanse. "Then find another heir," he replied coldly. "I have nothing left to give." Rashid's jaw tightened. "Do you think leadership is only about standing tall? Do you believe your worth is tied to your legs? You disgrace not just yourself, but your lineage with this defeatist attitude." Khalid turned his chair to face his father, his eyes blazing. "You don't understand. You stand there, whole, powerful, and demand I pretend I'm the same man I was. But I'm not. I'm broken." Rashid took a measured breath, his expression softening. "You're not broken, my son. You've simply forgotten who you are. But if you refuse to find that man again, then I'll bring someone to help you." Khalid scoffed. "Another doctor? Another therapist who'll spout cliches about perseverance? Spare me the lecture." "It's not a lecture. It's a command," Rashid said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. "She arrives tomorrow." The door closed behind the king, leaving Khalid alone with his anger and despair. He wheeled himself back to the window, the weight of his father's words pressing on his chest. Somewhere in the distant sands, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert into darkness. Khalid clenched his fists, feeling as though he were sinking with it. That night, sleep eluded him. Memories of his life before the accident flooded his mind. His passion for horseback riding, the admiration of his peers, and the way he had envisioned his future. Each memory was a dagger, a reminder of everything he had lost. Morning came too soon, and with it, the arrival of the person his father had promised. Khalid heard the commotion in the courtyard, the hum of an engine, the clipped tones of the guards. He didn't bother to investigate. Instead, he remained in his room, dreading yet another futile attempt to fix him. When the knock came at his door, he didn't respond. It opened anyway. "Good morning, Your Highness," a calm yet confident voice said. It was a woman's voice, unfamiliar and distinctly foreign. Khalid turned his chair reluctantly to face her. Standing in the doorway was a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair tied neatly back, her gaze steady and unflinching. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, practical and unpretentious, a stark contrast to the opulence of her surroundings. "I'm Layla," she said, stepping into the room. "Your new physiotherapist." Khalid's lips curled into a sardonic smile. "Another one? They really are persistent." "Persistence tends to work," she replied evenly. "That is, if you're willing to cooperate." He tilted his head, scrutinizing her. "And if I'm not?" Her expression didn't waver. "Then you'll continue as you are, and I'll have wasted my time. But somehow, I don't think you're as content with that as you pretend to be." The audacity of her words caught him off guard. Most people around him treaded carefully, fearing his wrath or sulking silences. but Layla's calm demeanor was disarming. Khalid's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. She took a step closer. Your father didn't bring me here to pity you, and I won't. My job is to help you find a way forward, but that only works if you're willing to try. If not, I'll leave right now. Khalid hesitated, the weight of her gaze unsettling. Part of him wanted to dismiss her, to cling to his bitterness, but another part, buried deep, was intrigued by her lack of deference. Fine, he said at last, his tone clipped. Do what you must, but don't expect miracles. Layla nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. Miracles aren't my specialty, Your Highness. Progress is. As she left the room to prepare for their first session, Khalid turned back to the window. The desert stretched before him, vast and unyielding, a mirror to the void he felt inside. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a glimmer of curiosity about what the days ahead might hold. The palace buzzed with subtle activity as Layla prepared for her first official session with Khalid. Servants whispered about the bold physiotherapist who had entered the prince's domain with a stride of confidence rarely seen in outsiders. Layla, however, remained unfazed. She had faced challenges far more daunting than a disgruntled royal. Her journey to this moment had been anything but ordinary. Years earlier, a devastating earthquake had taken everything from her home, her family, her sense of normalcy. From the ruins of her past, she had forged a new path, dedicating herself to helping others rebuild their lives. She knew pain intimately, but she also knew the power of resilience. It was this knowledge that had brought her here, to this gilded prison where Khalid had buried himself in self-pity. Standing outside his door, Layla inhaled deeply. The ornate carvings on the wood told stories of triumph and heritage, a stark contrast to the man who now resided within. Knocking firmly, she waited for an invitation. None came. After a moment, she opened the door herself. Khalid sat by the window, his profile silhouetted against the golden light spilling in from the desert. He didn't turn to acknowledge her. Your Highness, Layla began, her tone professional yet firm. I trust you've had time to consider our conversation from earlier. Silence. She took a step forward, her shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. If you're expecting me to grovel or beg for your cooperation, I won't. You're free to refuse this treatment, but know that by doing so, you're the only one prolonging your suffering. Khalid finally turned, his dark eyes narrowing as they met hers. You have a remarkable talent for stating the obvious. Did they train you for that? Layla smiled faintly. They trained me to see through excuses. You're angry, Your Highness. That's normal. But anger isn't a plan, it's a wall, and walls don't get you anywhere. Khalid studied her for a moment. Most people crumbled under his gaze, their confidence faltering in the presence of his bitterness. But Layla's steady composure was a challenge, and he found himself reluctantly intrigued. So what's your plan, Miss Layla? He asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Inspire me with your cliches? Convince me that life is still worth living? She met his sarcasm with calm resolve. My plan is simple. We start small, one session at a time. I don't expect you to feel inspired. I expect you to work. His brow arched. Work? On what? A body that doesn't cooperate? A future I can't envision? On the things you can control, she replied firmly. And whether you like it or not, you have more control than you think. Her words hung in the air, challenging him in a way that few dared. For a brief moment, Khalid considered dismissing her outright. Yet there was something in her voice, an unshakable certainty that stirred a flicker of curiosity. Fine, he said finally, gesturing toward the wheelchair. Let's see what your work entails. The first session took place in a bright room overlooking the palace gardens. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns on the tiled floor. Khalid's chair was positioned in the center of the room, surrounded by various pieces of equipment Layla had meticulously arranged. Today is about assessment, Layla explained as she adjusted a set of parallel bars. I need to understand where you're starting from before we set any goals. Khalid's expression darkened. Goals, he muttered, as if I haven't heard that word enough. Layla ignored his remark, kneeling beside him to adjust the straps on his legs. Her touch was clinical, devoid of the pity he had come to expect from others. It was unsettling but also strangely comforting. "Try to move your right leg," she instructed. Khalid clenched his jaw, focusing intently. The limb twitched, but no more. A surge of frustration shot through him, and he slammed his fist against the armrest of his chair. "It's useless," he growled. "It's not useless," Layla countered, her tone even. "It's weak, and weakness can be rebuilt." Her unwavering demeanor grated on him, but it also planted a seed of determination he wasn't ready to admit. They moved through a series of exercises, each one a grueling reminder of his limitations. Yet through it all, Layla remained patient, offering neither false encouragement nor empty reassurances. By the end of the session, Khalid was drenched in sweat, his hands trembling from exertion. Layla handed him the towel, her expression unreadable. "Good work," she said simply. He scoffed. "If that's what you call good, I'd hate to see your definition of bad." Her lips quirked in a small smile. "Progress isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when you don't want to." Khalid didn't reply. As she packed up the equipment, he found himself watching her with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. There was something about her quiet strength, her refusal to coddle him, that struck a nerve. Before she left, Layla turned to him. "Same time tomorrow. And don't bother with the excuses. I've heard them all before." Khalid stared after her as she exited the room, the faintest trace of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. For the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of something other than anger, a tentative, reluctant hope. The next morning, Khalid found himself once again in the bright rehabilitation room. The same sunlight filtered through the windows, but this time it felt less inviting. He stared at the parallel bars, his hands resting heavily on the wheels of his chair. Layla was already arranging equipment with methodical precision. Her calm presence filled the room, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions churning inside him. "You're quiet today," she observed as she approached. "Just saving my energy for whatever pointless exercise you've planned," he replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Layla didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she moved a step closer and placed a hand lightly on the bars. "It's not pointless, Your Highness. These bars are where we begin to remind your body that it's capable of more than you think." Khalid's jaw tightened. "You talk as if optimism is enough to fix this." "I don't deal in optimism," she replied calmly. "I deal in facts. And the fact is, progress is possible, but only if you're willing to meet it halfway." There was a silence between them as Khalid considered her words. Part of him wanted to lash out, to push her away as he had done with everyone else. But there was another part, a quieter, more desperate part, that wanted to believe she might be right. With a resigned sigh, he nodded toward the bars. "Let's get this over with." The session began with stretches and small movements, each one a test of his body's capabilities. Khalid gritted his teeth through the discomfort, his pride battling against his frustration. Layla's instructions were firm but encouraging, her voice steady as she guided him through each step. "Grip the bars," she said at one point, kneeling beside him. "We're gonna try standing today." Khalid froze. "Standing?" His voice was sharp with disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am," she said simply. "With my support and the braces, you'll be safe. The goal isn't perfection, it's effort." He hesitated, his gaze flicking between her and the bars. Memories of his former strength flooded his mind, sharp and cruel in their clarity. The idea of standing something once so effortless now felt insurmountable. Layla seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's not about reclaiming who you were," she said softly. "It's about discovering who you can become." Her words cut through the haze of doubt, and for a moment, he allowed himself to trust her. Slowly, he gripped the bars, his hands tightening around the cool metal. "On my count," she said, positioning herself beside him. 1, 2, 3. With a grunt of effort, Khalid pushed against the weight of his own body. His arms trembled as he bore down on the bars, and for a fleeting second, he felt the sensation of being upright. But the strain was too much. His legs buckled, and he collapsed back into the chair. The sound of his heavy breathing filled the room. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands ached from gripping the bars so tightly. He looked up at Layla, expecting disappointment or pity in her expression. Instead, he saw something else. Pride. "That was a good start," she said, her tone warm. "You held your weight longer than I expected." He let out a bitter laugh. "If that's what you call success, I can't imagine what failure looks like." "Failure," she replied evenly, "is refusing to try, and you didn't do that today." Her words hit harder than he anticipated. He looked away, unwilling to let her see the flicker of emotion in his eyes. The session ended, and Layla began packing up the equipment. Khaled sat in silence, staring at the bars as if they were mocking him. "You're angry," she said after a moment. He didn't deny it. "I hate this," he admitted, his voice low. "I hate feeling weak. I hate needing help." Layla paused, her movements deliberate as she turned to face him. "I understand, but you're not weak, Khaled. You're wounded. There's a difference." The use of his first name caught him off guard, and he looked up at her, startled. Her gaze was steady, her words spoken without judgment. "Wounds heal," she continued, "but only if you let them. If you keep focusing on what you've lost, you'll never see what you still have." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a nod, Layla gathered her things and left the room, leaving Khaled alone with his thoughts. That night, as Khaled sat by the window, he replayed the session in his mind. The feeling of standing, however brief, lingered like a phantom sensation. It wasn't much, but it was something, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. He thought of Layla's words, the way she had spoken with conviction and compassion. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that she might be right. Perhaps progress wasn't about reclaiming the past. Perhaps it was about moving forward, step by step. As the desert wind whispered through the palace walls, Khaled clenched his fists, determination settling over him like a second skin. Tomorrow, he decided, he would try again. The third morning of sessions arrived with a sense of anticipation that Khaled couldn't quite name. He had spent the night restlessly, replaying the brief moment when he had managed to bear his own weight, even if just for a second. The idea of trying again filled him with equal parts dread and determination. Layla was already in the rehabilitation room when he arrived. She was arranging the equipment, her movements precise and efficient. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm but attentive. "Good morning, Your Highness," she greeted, her tone neutral. "Morning," he replied curtly, rolling his chair into position. He didn't offer more, but she didn't seem to expect it. Without preamble, she began. "Today, we'll push a little further. Your muscles need time to adjust, but consistency is key. The goal is to increase your stamina." Khaled nodded, his gaze fixed on the parallel bars. The exercises started similarly to the previous day, but Layla subtly increased the intensity. She adjusted his posture, guided his movements, and occasionally offered words of encouragement that were neither overbearing nor patronizing. As the session progressed, Khaled found himself speaking without intending to. "Why do you do this?" Layla glanced at him, momentarily pausing her adjustments. "Do what?" "This," he said, gesturing to the equipment and then to her. "Dealing with stubborn people like me, it can't be easy." A small smile played at the corners of her lips. "It's not always easy, no. But I've seen what happens when people choose to fight for themselves. I've seen lives change." He frowned, considering her words. "But why? Why do you care so much?" Her expression grew thoughtful. "Because someone once cared enough to help me when I couldn't see a way forward. I wouldn't be here if they hadn't." Khaled raised an eyebrow. "Your family?" The question lingered for a moment before she answered, her voice quieter. "No, my family's gone." He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The revelation was unexpected, and it added a layer of depth to the woman who had, until now, been a professional force of nature. Layla straightened, her gaze meeting his. "This isn't about me, Your Highness. It's about you. And you still haven't told me why you're here today when you could have refused." Khalid opened his mouth to retort, but the words didn't come. He looked away, his grip tightening on the bars. "I don't know," he admitted at last. "Maybe I just got tired of sitting still." Layla nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's a start." The session ended with noticeable progress. Khalid managed to hold himself upright for a few seconds longer than the previous day, and though his body protested, a small sense of accomplishment took root. Layla's instructions and firm presence kept him grounded, her belief in his potential unwavering. Later, as she gathered her things, she paused by the door. "You're stronger than you think, Khalid. You just need to stop fighting yourself." Her use of his first name caught him off guard again, but he didn't correct her. Instead, he watched her leave, the echo of her words lingering in the room. That evening, Khalid found himself wandering the palace gardens for the first time in months. The scent of jasmine filled the air, and the sound of a distant fountain provided a soothing backdrop. The cool desert breeze brushed against his face, a welcome reprieve from the stifling atmosphere of his chambers. He spotted Layla sitting on a bench near the fountain, a notebook open on her lap. She seemed lost in thought, her pen moving steadily across the page. For a moment, he considered turning back, unwilling to interrupt, but something compelled him forward. "Writing reports about me?" he asked as he approached. She looked up, surprised but not startled. "No, just writing." Khalid raised an eyebrow. "About what?" She closed the notebook, her smile faint. "Thoughts, ideas. Sometimes it helps to put things into words." He nodded, unsure of what to say next. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, she broke it. "You surprised me today." "How so?" "You pushed yourself harder than you needed to," she said. "You didn't have to, but you did. That tells me you're starting to believe in the possibility of change." Khalid sat back in his chair, staring at the fountain. "Belief is a luxury, Layla. One I'm not sure I can afford." She studied him for a moment. "Belief isn't about luxury. It's about necessity. Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us moving." He didn't respond, but her words settled into the corners of his mind, refusing to be dismissed. The days that followed saw Khalid making slow but steady progress. Each session brought new challenges, and with them, new frustrations. Yet Layla's unwavering presence and her quiet strength began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. Their conversations became more frequent, often spilling beyond the confines of the rehabilitation room. Khalid found himself opening up in ways he hadn't anticipated, sharing fragments of his thoughts and his past. Layla, in turn, offered glimpses of her own experiences, though she remained guarded about certain details. As their connection deepened, Khalid began to notice a shift within himself. The bitterness that had once consumed him started to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him of the man he had once been and the man he might still become. The routine they had built over the past week seemed almost unshakable. Each morning, Khalid would wheel himself to the rehabilitation room where Layla awaited him. Their sessions were grueling, but each small victory fueled a sense of accomplishment that neither of them spoke about aloud. Despite his outward grumbles, Khalid had begun to anticipate these moments, even as they tested the limits of his patience and strength. But today was different. From the start, Khalid felt off. His muscles were stiff, his focus fractured, and his temper sharper than usual. As Layla adjusted the braces on his legs, he could feel irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "Your posture is tense," she observed, tightening the straps. "Relax your shoulders. You're making this harder on yourself." "I'm fine," Khalid snapped, his tone harsher than intended. Layla paused, her steady gaze meeting his. "Fine doesn't look like this," she said evenly. "If something's wrong, tell me." Khalid gritted his teeth. "I said I'm fine. Can we just get on with it?" Layla didn't press further. Instead, She moved to the parallel bars and motioned for him to follow. "All right, let's focus on your balance today. You've been improving, but we need to refine your control." Khaled maneuvered into position, gripping the bars tightly. The weight of his body felt heavier than usual, and his arms ached before they'd even begun. Layla guided him as he lifted himself slightly, her hands firm and steady on his waist. "Good," she said softly. "Now hold it." The seconds dragged on, each one an eternity. Khaled's muscles trembled, and sweat beaded on his brow. His grip on the bars slipped slightly, and panic surged through him. "I can't," he said, his voice strained. "Yes, you can," Layla replied firmly. "Just a little longer." But his arms gave out, and he fell back into the wheelchair with a thud. The defeat hit him harder than the physical strain, and he slammed his fists against the armrests in frustration. "Damn it," he shouted, the echo of his voice filling the room. "What's the point of this? I'm never going to walk again." Layla stepped back, giving him space to vent his anger. Her expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of something concerned, perhaps behind her eyes. "Today's not your best," she said after a moment. "That happens. Progress isn't linear." Khaled glared at her, his frustration spilling over. "Stop saying that. Stop pretending this is anything but a waste of time. I'm not some charity case you can fix with platitudes." Her calm cracked just slightly, her voice sharpening. "And I'm not here to fix you, Khaled. I'm here to help you if you're willing to help yourself. But if you want to quit, that's your choice." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Khaled's anger simmered, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned his chair abruptly and wheeled himself out of the room, leaving Layla standing in silence. The rest of the day passed in a blur of bitterness and self-recrimination. Khaled avoided the rehabilitation room and anyone who might question his absence. He retreated to the sanctuary of his chambers, the weight of his earlier failure pressing down on him. By evening, his anger had dulled into a heavy ache. He stared out at the desert, the vast expanse mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. For months, he had convinced himself that isolation was his only solace. But now, it felt more like a prison. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He didn't respond, expecting whoever it was to leave. Instead, the door opened, and Layla stepped inside, a tray in her hands. "I figured you wouldn't make it to dinner," she said, placing the tray on a nearby table. Her tone was neutral, but there was no mistaking the undercurrent of concern. "I didn't ask for company," Khaled muttered, his back to her. "No, you didn't," she replied, pulling up a chair and sitting down. "But here I am." Silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Finally, Layla spoke. "Do you know what I hated most after I lost my family?" Khaled glanced at her, surprised by the sudden shift in topic. She met his gaze, her expression steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I hated how people tried to tell me it would get better," she continued, "that I'd find a way to move on. That time would heal everything. It felt like they were dismissing my pain, like they didn't understand what I'd lost." Her voice softened. "But one day, someone told me something different. They said healing isn't about forgetting what you've lost. It's about learning to carry it in a way that doesn't break you." Khaled looked away, her words hitting closer to home than he cared to admit. "And what if it already has?" he asked quietly. "It hasn't," she said firmly. "You're still here, Khaled. That means you're stronger than you think." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, reluctantly, Khaled turned his chair to face her. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine curiosity. Layla hesitated, as if weighing her answer. "Because I've seen what happens when people give up," she said finally, "and I don't want that for you." Her sincerity was disarming, and Khaled found himself nodding slowly. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, his tone softer than before. Layla smiled faintly, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "Good, and try to get some rest. Tomorrow's another step." The next day, Khaled arrived at the rehabilitation room with a renewed sense of determination. He didn't apologize for his outburst, and Layla didn't expect him to. Instead, she greeted him with a simple nod, as though the previous day's frustrations were already forgotten. "Today, we're going somewhere different," she announced. Khalid frowned. "Different how?" "You'll see," she said, gesturing toward his wheelchair. "Come on." Intrigued and slightly wary, Khalid followed as Layla led him through the palace corridors. The familiar route to the rehabilitation room was quickly replaced by unfamiliar hallways, and soon they stepped out into the courtyard where an SUV waited. A driver stood by, ready to assist. "We're leaving the palace?" Khalid asked, his voice laced with surprise. "Yes," Layla replied, her tone firm. "You've spent too much time trapped here. It's time to remind you that there's a world beyond these walls." He hesitated, torn between curiosity and resistance. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, but if this turns into another lecture, I'm not staying." Layla smirked. Noted. The drive through the city was quiet, Khalid gazing out the window as the bustling streets of Al-Zahra unfolded before him. It had been months since he'd seen his people, their lives carrying on while he remained hidden. The sight stirred something in him, a mixture of longing and guilt. Their destination was a small village on the outskirts of the city. The contrast between the opulence of the palace and the modest simplicity of the village was stark. Children played in the dirt roads, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze, while adults went about their work with quiet efficiency. "Why here?" Khalid asked as the SUV came to a stop. "You'll see," Layla said again, stepping out and motioning for the driver to help Khalid. Once he was out of the vehicle, Layla led him through the village. The curious gazes of the villagers followed them, but there was no malice, only intrigue. Khalid felt exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated, but Layla's calm presence steadied him. They arrived at a small community center where a group of people, men, women, and children, were gathered. Some were in wheelchairs, others using crutches or prosthetics. Khalid's eyes widened as he took in the sight. "These are some of the people I've worked with," Layla explained quietly. "Many of them have faced challenges similar to yours or worse, and yet they're here, rebuilding their lives." Khalid watched as a young boy, no older than 8, took tentative steps with the help of crutches. His face was scrunched in concentration, but his determination was palpable. When he finally made it to the end of the room, the small crowd erupted in applause. The boy beamed, and Khalid felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked Layla, his voice low. "Because I want you to see what's possible," she said. These people didn't give up, Khalid. They found strength in themselves and in each other. Over the next hour, Khalid observed the group as they practiced exercises and encouraged one another. Layla introduced him to a few of them, though she didn't push him to participate. Instead, she let him absorb the experience at his own pace. One man, a farmer named Yusuf, shared his story of losing a leg in an accident and how he had learned to walk again with a prosthetic. "It wasn't easy," Yusuf admitted, "but giving up wasn't an option. I had a family to provide for." Khalid listened quietly, his usual sarcasm subdued. For the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of a connection to something larger than himself. As they left the center, Khalid turned to Layla. "Do you do this often? Bring people here?" "Not often," she replied. "But sometimes, seeing others fight for themselves is the best motivation." He nodded thoughtfully, the image of the young boy with crutches lingering in his mind. "That kid," he said after a moment, "he reminded me of myself. Before the accident?" Layla finished for him. Khalid nodded. "I used to think I was invincible. Now I don't know who I am." Layla stopped walking and turned to face him. "You're still Khalid," she said gently. "You're just a version of him that's still finding his way." Her words settled over him like a balm, soothing the jagged edges of his doubt. For the first time, he didn't push them away. The drive back to the palace was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. Instead, it felt reflective, as though Khalid was beginning to piece together something he hadn't realized he was missing. As they pulled into the courtyard, Layla glanced at him. "We'll continue the usual sessions tomorrow, but if you ever want to go back, just let me know." Khalid gave her a small, almost reluctant smile. "I might take you up on that." The following days were marked by a subtle but undeniable change in Khalid. He approached each session with more focus and determination, pushing himself harder than before. Layla noticed the shift immediately, though she didn't comment on it outright. Instead, she matched his pace, challenging him in ways that kept him motivated without overwhelming him. During one session, Khalid managed to stand with the help of the parallel bars for a full 20 seconds, his longest attempt yet. His arms trembled with effort, and his breath came in sharp gasps. But when he finally sat back down, there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "You're getting stronger," Layla said, offering him a towel. He took it without a word, dabbing the sweat from his forehead. After a moment, he glanced at her. "Do you ever stop pushing people?" She smiled faintly. "Not when I know they can handle it." Khalid let out a short laugh, surprising himself. "You're relentless. You know that?" "I've been called worse," she replied, her tone teasing. The lightness of the moment lingered between them, a rare break from the intensity of their usual dynamic. Khalid found himself studying her as she moved about the room, adjusting equipment and taking notes. There was an ease to her presence that he hadn't noticed before, a quiet confidence that seemed to anchor him in ways he didn't fully understand. Later that afternoon, Khalid found himself in the palace gardens again. The desert breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and the sound of birds chirping filled the air. He had come here often in recent weeks, seeking a sense of calm that his chambers couldn't provide. To his surprise, he spotted Layla sitting by the fountain, a book in her hands. She looked up as he approached, her expression softening into a smile. "Taking a break from tormenting me?" he asked, his tone light. "Even I need a break sometimes," she replied, closing the book. "What about you? Shouldn't you be resting after this morning session?" "I thought I'd enjoy the peace while it lasts," he said, maneuvering his wheelchair closer. "Though I didn't expect to find you here. It's one of my favorite spots," she admitted. "The gardens remind me of my grandparents' home." They had a small courtyard filled with flowers. Khalid raised an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as someone who grew up around gardens." She smiled wistfully. Not really. My grandparents lived in the countryside, but my parents moved to the city when I was young. I only visited on holidays, but those visits left an impression." There was a hint of sadness in her voice, and Khalid hesitated before asking, "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I've learned that missing something doesn't mean you can't find beauty in other places." Her words resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. He thought of the life he'd once had, the freedom, the independence, the sense of invincibility, and how much he missed it. But perhaps, like her, he could learn to find beauty in what remained. Their conversation drifted to other topics, growing more personal as the minutes passed. Khalid shared stories of his childhood, moments of mischief and adventure that brought a rare smile to his face. Layla, in turn, told him about her studies, her work, and the challenges she had faced along the way. "You're surprisingly easy to talk to," Khalid said at one point, his tone thoughtful. Layla tilted her head, amused. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "It's an observation," he replied with a smirk. "Take it as you will." She laughed softly, the sound light and genuine. "I'll take it." Over the next few weeks, their bond continued to deepen. Khalid's progress in his physical therapy was matched by a growing sense of trust and affection between him and Layla. She became more than just his therapist. She became a confidant, someone who saw past the walls he had built and refused to let him retreat behind them. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, Khalid leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "Do you ever get tired of this?" he asked. "Tired of what?" Layla replied, wiping her hands with a towel. "Dealing with people like me," he said, his tone half serious. "People who resist, push back, and make your job harder than it needs to be." She looked at him thoughtfully. "If I did, I wouldn't be here. But the truth is, you're not as difficult as you think." Khalid raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "Take it as you will," she said, echoing his earlier words with a teasing smile. Despite the progress, There were moments of tension. Khalid's frustration sometimes flared, and Layla's patience wasn't infinite. But those moments were becoming fewer, replaced by an unspoken understanding that seemed to bridge the gaps between them. One evening, as they sat in the gardens after a session, Khalid found himself studying her in the fading light. The way the golden hues of the sunset played across her features, the quiet strength in her posture, it was a sight that stirred something deep within him. "You've changed me," he said quietly, the words surprising even himself. Layla looked at him, her expression softening. "No, Khalid, you've changed yourself. I just helped you see that it was possible." The steady rhythm of Khalid's progress was soon interrupted by forces beyond their control. Within the palace, whispers of Khalid's therapy sessions and his budding relationship with Layla began to circulate. While many of the servants admired Layla's dedication, others viewed her presence with suspicion, wondering why a foreigner had been granted such access to the crown prince. The murmurs eventually reached the ears of the royal advisors, whose concerns grew louder by the day. One morning, Khalid sat in his chambers, scanning over a pile of papers detailing updates on royal matters. The sharp knock at his door drew his attention. Without waiting for an invitation, his father's trusted advisor Saeed entered, his expression grave. "Your Highness," Saeed began, bowing slightly. "May I have a word?" Khalid set the papers aside and gestured for him to proceed. "What is it?" "There are concerns regarding Miss Layla," Saeed said carefully. "Her influence over you has not gone unnoticed." Khalid's expression darkened. "Her influence? She's my physiotherapist. What exactly do you think she's doing?" "It is not just her role, Your Highness," Saeed replied. "It's her proximity to you. Many are questioning whether her presence is appropriate, given the circumstances." Khalid's jaw tightened. "Appropriate? She's here because she's helping me regain my strength. That's more than I can say for most of the people wringing their hands in concern." Saeed hesitated, then pressed on. "With all due respect, Your Highness, the optics of this matter. A foreigner working so closely with the future king. There are those who see it as a threat to tradition, to stability." Khalid's voice was low and cold. "And what would you have me do, Saeed? Send her away? Undo months of progress because of some paranoid whispers?" "I only ask that you consider the implications," Saeed said, his tone measured. "Your people are watching, and perception is often as important as reality." When Saeed left, Khalid sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over him. For the first time in weeks, doubt crept into his mind, its tendrils wrapping tightly around the fragile hope he had been nurturing. That afternoon, the tension followed him to the rehabilitation room. Layla greeted him as usual, her calm demeanor unchanged. But Khalid's responses were clipped, his focus scattered. "Something on your mind?" Layla asked as he fumbled with the parallel bars. "No," he said curtly, avoiding her gaze. Layla raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Instead, she adjusted his position and continued with the session. The exercises felt harder than usual, each movement weighed down by the unspoken turmoil in Khalid's mind. By the end of the session, his frustration boiled over. "Why isn't this getting easier?" he snapped, slamming his hand against the bar. "I'm doing everything right, and it still feels impossible." Layla stepped back, giving him space to vent. "Progress isn't a straight line," she said evenly. "You know that." "Don't give me that," he retorted. "You don't understand what it's like to have everyone watching, waiting for you to fail." Her eyes narrowed. "You think I don't understand pressure? I've spent my life proving myself to people who doubted me. You're not the only one who's had to fight." The sharpness in her voice caught him off guard, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Khalid looked away, his anger cooling into guilt. "I didn't mean that," he said quietly. "I'm just tired." Layla nodded, her expression softening. "I know, but don't let that tiredness make you forget how far you've come." That evening, as Khalid sat by the fountain in the gardens, he heard footsteps approaching. He didn't need to look up to know it was Layla. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "Suit yourself," he muttered. She sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. the sound of the water filling the silence. "I heard about Saeed's visit," she said finally. Khalid stiffened. "Who told you?" "It doesn't matter," she replied. "What matters is that it's bothering you." He let out a bitter laugh. "It's not just Saeed. It's everyone. They all think I'm a failure waiting to happen, and now they're questioning you because of me." Layla tilted her head, studying him. "Is that what you think? That I'd let their opinions scare me off?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I've already caused enough problems for myself. I don't want to drag you into them." She reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "You're not dragging me anywhere, Khalid. I chose to be here. And if some people can't see the value in what we're doing, that's their problem, not ours." Her words were firm, but there was an undercurrent of warmth that steadied him. For the first time since Saeed's visit, Khalid felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. The next day, the tension between them had eased. Layla approached their session with her usual focus, but there was a renewed sense of camaraderie in the way they worked together. Khalid's movements were stronger, more deliberate, and for the first time, he managed a full step with the help of the parallel bars. When he sat back in his chair, panting from the effort, Layla smiled. "That's progress." Khalid met her gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's a start." "It's more than a start," she said. "It's proof that you're capable of more than you think." Her words stayed with him long after the session ended, a reminder that even in the face of doubt and opposition, he was moving forward. The palace was quiet that evening, but Khalid's mind was anything but. The day's successes in therapy should have filled him with pride. Yet the lingering tension from Saeed's warnings and the growing scrutiny over his relationship with Layla gnawed at him. He wheeled himself through the halls, restless. The vast corridors that once symbolized power and security now felt stifling, as though their marble walls were closing in on him. When he found himself at the entrance to the rehabilitation room, he hesitated before opening the door. Inside, Layla was organizing the equipment for the next day's session. She looked up, surprised to see him there so late. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her tone light. Khalid rolled forward, stopping near the parallel bars. "Something like that." Layla studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, the words forming on his lips before he could stop them. "Saeed wasn't wrong," he said quietly. "People are talking about us, about you." She didn't flinch, though her hand stilled. "I figured as much. It's hard to go unnoticed in a place like this." Khalid leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the wheels of his chair. "You deserve better than this, better than being scrutinized because of me. Maybe it's time you left." The words felt like a betrayal as they left his mouth, but he couldn't stop himself. He had spent so long protecting himself from vulnerability, from pain, and now it seemed the only way to protect Layla was to push her away. Layla's gaze didn't waver. She stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Is that what you want, Khalid? For me to leave?" "I want you to have a life that isn't tied to my problems," he said, his tone tight. "You've already given me more than I deserve." Her brow furrowed, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. "You don't get to decide what I deserve, Khalid. That's my choice, not yours." He looked away, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "It's not that simple." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But running away from this, whatever this is, doesn't make it any easier." Her words struck a chord deep within him, unraveling the careful defenses he had built. For a moment, he was silent, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him like the desert heat. Finally, he looked up at her, his voice raw. "I don't know how to do this, Layla. I don't know how to let someone in." She knelt beside him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Then let me show you." The next morning, Khalid woke with a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in months. Layla's words had stayed with him through the night, a lifeline that had pulled him out of the depths of his doubt. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a future that wasn't defined by his limitations or the expectations of others, a future where he could define his own path. When he arrived at the rehabilitation room, Layla was waiting, as always. There was a quiet understanding between them as they began the session. Khalid's movements were deliberate, each step along the parallel bars a testament to his growing strength. "Good," Layla said, her voice steady. "Now let's push a little further." Khalid gritted his teeth and nodded, lifting himself upright. The strain was intense, his muscles trembling with effort, but he held the position longer than he ever had before. When he finally sat back, he was drenched in sweat, but the satisfaction in his expression was unmistakable. "See?" Layla said with a small smile. "You're stronger than you think." Khalid met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't doubt her words. Later that day, Khalid summoned his father to his chambers. King Rashid arrived with a curious expression, his hands clasped behind his back. "You asked to see me?" the king said. Khalid nodded, his posture straighter than usual. "I want to attend the national unity ceremony next week." The king raised an eyebrow, his surprise evident. "That's a public event, Khalid. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of exposure?" "I'm not," Khalid admitted. "But I need to do this for myself and for the people. They need to see that I'm still capable of leading." King Rashid studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Very well. But this will be a challenge, Khalid. You'll be under scrutiny." "I know," Khalid said firmly, "but I'm ready." As the days passed, preparations for the ceremony consumed the palace. Layla worked closely with Khalid to ensure he was physically and mentally prepared for the event. They practiced walking short distances with the help of an exoskeleton, each step a grueling but vile stone. "You'll be fine," Layla reassured him the night before the ceremony. "Just focus on what you've achieved, not what people expect." Khalid nodded, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his chest. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said quietly. Layla smiled, her expression warm. "You've always had it in you, Khalid. I just helped you see it." The day of the ceremony arrived, and the palace was abuzz with activity. Khalid stood backstage, the exoskeleton fitted securely to his legs. The weight of the device was both a burden and a comfort, a symbol of how far he had come. When his name was announced, the crowd fell silent. Khalid took a deep breath, his hands gripping the handles of his walker. With Layla and his father watching from the wings, he stepped forward. The first step was slow, deliberate. The second came faster, and then the third. Each movement drew a ripple of murmurs from the crowd, followed by scattered applause. By the time Khalid reached the podium, the applause had grown into a thunderous roar. Standing tall, he addressed his people, his voice steady. "This journey hasn't been easy, but it has taught me the value of resilience and the power of determination. Together, we can face any challenge, no matter how great." As he finished speaking, the cheers of the crowd echoed through the plaza. Khalid looked to Layla, who was smiling through tears. For the first time in months, he felt like himself again, not the man he once was, but someone stronger, someone ready to lead. The echoes of the national unity ceremony still lingered in the palace, the cheers of the crowd resonating in Khalid's mind long after the event had ended. For the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't dared to embrace: pride. Not the pride of the untouchable prince he once was, but the quiet, hard-earned pride of someone who had fought to reclaim a sense of purpose. He sat in the gardens that evening, the golden light of sunset painting the horizon. The exoskeleton rested beside him, a reminder of the steps he had taken that day, both physical and symbolic. The sound of footsteps approached, and he turned to see Layla making her way toward him. "You should be resting," she said as she sat down beside him, her tone teasing but warm. Khalid chuckled softly. "I missed this view?" "Not a chance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fountain's gentle trickle filling the space between them. Finally, Khalid spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "For everything?" Layla tilted her head, studying him. "You don't need to thank me, Khalid. You did this. Not alone," he replied, meeting her gaze. "You believed in me when I couldn't. You pushed me, challenged me, and never let me give up. That means something." She smiled, her eyes soft. "I think you would have found your way eventually, with or without me." He shook his head. "Maybe, but it wouldn't have been the same." In the days following the ceremony, the palace was abuzz with newfound energy. Advisors who had once doubted Khalid's ability to lead now spoke of his resilience with admiration. The people of Al-Zahra, inspired by his determination, rallied behind him with a renewed sense of loyalty. Despite the triumph, Khalid couldn't shake a lingering thought. His journey of recovery had been deeply personal, but it had also highlighted something larger: how many others in his kingdom faced similar struggles without the resources or support he had been fortunate enough to receive. During one of their sessions, Khalid shared his thoughts with Layla. "I want to create something," he said, his tone decisive. "A program that provides therapy and resources for people like me, people who feel like their lives are over after an injury." Layla's face lit up with pride. "That's an incredible idea, and it's something only you could do." He nodded, already envisioning the possibilities. "I'll need your help to make it happen." Her expression softened, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Khalid, there's something I need to tell you." Later that evening, Layla found Khalid in his study, her expression more serious than usual. He set his papers aside, sensing the weight of what she was about to say. "I've been offered a position with an international rehabilitation organization," she said carefully. "It's a chance to expand the work I've been doing here on a global scale." Khalid's chest tightened. He had known, deep down, that this moment might come. Layla's dedication to her work, her drive to make a difference, was one of the things he admired most about her. But the thought of her leaving left him feeling unmoored. "That's amazing," he said finally, his voice steady but strained. "You deserve it." She nodded, her gaze fixed on him. "I haven't decided yet." He frowned. "Why not?" "It's an incredible opportunity." "Because of you," she admitted softly. "Because of what we've built here, what we've built together." Her words hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Khalid leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "I don't want to hold you back, Layla. You've already given me more than I could have asked for." "You're not holding me back," she said firmly. "But I need to know if this, what we have, means as much to you as it does to me." Khalid's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent so long avoiding vulnerability, building walls around himself to keep others out. But now, as he looked into Layla's eyes, he knew that those walls no longer served him. "It does," he said finally, his voice raw with honesty. "More than I can put into words." She smiled faintly, a hint of relief in her expression. "Then let's figure this out together." In the weeks that followed, Khalid and Layla worked tirelessly, balancing the demands of their growing relationship with their shared vision for the future. They laid the groundwork for the rehabilitation program, drawing on Layla's expertise and Khalid's influence to create something truly transformative. As the program began to take shape, Khalid encouraged Layla to accept the international position, knowing that her work would have an even greater impact. She agreed, but with a compromise. They would continue to build their lives together, even if it meant navigating the challenges of distance and duty. On the day of the program's launch, Khalid stood before a crowd of supporters, his voice steady and confident as he spoke about the importance of resilience and community. "This program is more than just a resource," he said. "It's a testament to the strength we all have within us, the strength to overcome, to rebuild, and to thrive." As the crowd erupted in applause, Khalid turned to Layla, who stood beside him, her eyes shining with pride. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they had not only found their way back to themselves, but also to each other.